The building is still there. On Michigan Avenue, facing the restless gray surface of Lake Michigan, the Congress Plaza Hotel stands with a kind of quiet defiance. Its windows reflect the same skyline that has outgrown it. Traffic moves past without hesitation. Tourists pass beneath its awnings, often without looking up. There is no obvious ruin here. No broken facade. No charred beams. No caution tape. And yet, something is missing. Step inside, and the air changes. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. The lobby is intact, polished even, but the space feels larger than it should. Sound carries too far. Footsteps echo longer than they ought to. It is the kind of silence that does not come from emptiness, but from absence, the absence of what used to fill it. Because this was never meant to be a quiet place. There was a time when the Congress Plaza Hotel was one of the most powerful addresses in Chicago. A place where presidents slept, where deals were struck behind heavy doors, where orchestras played beneath chandeliers so bright they erased the night outside. A place designed not just for comfort, but for spectacle, for the performance of wealth, of influence, of permanence. And now it endures, but only in fragments. A shell still standing, a reputation fractured, a story that does not sit easily in memory. The question is not simply what happened here. The question is why. Why does a building built to embody permanence feel, today, like something that slipped through history's fingers? Why did a place that hosted the most powerful figures of its time become, over decades, something else entirely? Something whispered about more than celebrated. And perhaps more importantly, who allowed it to happen? Because buildings do not fall from greatness on their own. They are neglected. They are repurposed. They are abandoned in ways that are often invisible at first. A decision here, a compromise there, a quiet shift in priorities. Until one day, the transformation is complete and no single moment can be blamed. But the consequences remain. Standing in the lobby today, you can still see the bones of ambition, the marble floors, the tall columns, the deliberate symmetry of a space meant to impress those who entered it. It was designed to communicate something very specific, that Chicago was not merely a city of industry, but a city of refinement, of culture, of arrival. And for a time it worked. But buildings are not just architecture. They are agreements between those who build them and those who use them, between intention and reality. And when those agreements begin to fracture, the structure itself, no matter how grand, cannot hold its meaning. The Congress Plaza Hotel did not collapse in a single dramatic event. It did not burn, or flood, or vanish overnight. Its story is more unsettling than that. It changed slowly, visibly, and yet almost without resistance. Which raises another question. Was this decline inevitable, or was it chosen? In 1942, a Chicago Tribune article described the hotel as a place where the city meets itself at its highest level. The phrasing is careful, almost ceremonial. It captures not just what the hotel was, but what it represented, a kind of civic identity embodied in stone and light. But identities shift, cities evolve, and sometimes what once symbolized prestige becomes inconvenient, expensive, outdated, a relic of a version of the city that no longer aligns with its priorities. What happens then is rarely dramatic. It is administrative, financial, quiet. Budgets tighten. Maintenance is deferred. Ownership changes hands. The people who once defined the space stop coming, and new occupants, often with different needs, different expectations, begin to reshape it, not with grand renovations, but with small, practical adjustments. The transformation is gradual enough to avoid attention, until it is too late. A former employee, interviewed decades later, described the shift in a way that feels almost too simple. It didn't feel like something ended. It felt like something stopped being cared about. Not destroyed, not abandoned, just no longer prioritized. And that distinction matters, because it suggests that the story of the Congress Plaza Hotel is not just about architecture or economics. It is about attention, about what a society chooses to maintain, and what it allows to fade, not out of necessity, but out of indifference. Outside, the lake remains unchanged. The wind still moves across its surface with the same indifference it carried a century ago. The skyline has grown taller, sharper, more confident. Glass towers now rise where older buildings once stood, each one reflecting a newer version of the city's ambition. And the hotel remains, caught somewhere between those versions. Not fully preserved, not fully lost, just present. There is a particular kind of discomfort in places like this, not because they are haunted in the conventional sense, but because they carry evidence of decisions, human decisions, that are still visible, still legible, if you know how to look. A worn carpet where there should have been replacement, a closed wing that was never reopened, a grandeur that feels slightly out of sync with its current use. These are not accidents. They are records, and they tell a story that is more complicated than nostalgia allows. Because it is easy to mourn a building, it is harder to examine the reasons it was allowed to change. Harder still to ask who benefited from that change and who did not. The Congress Plaza Hotel is often described today in fragments. Historic, haunted, controversial, each label capturing a piece of its identity, but none of them fully explaining it. To understand what happened here, you have to move beyond the surface, beyond the architecture, beyond the reputation, beyond even the stories that have accumulated over time. You have to look at the choices, the deliberate ones, and the quiet ones, the ones made in boardrooms and the ones made through inaction. Because somewhere in that accumulation, in the slow layering of decisions, lies the answer to the question that still lingers in its halls. Not just what this place was, but why it became what it is now, and whether that outcome was ever truly unavoidable. Chicago, in the late 19th century, was a city still negotiating with its own ambition. The land along Michigan Avenue, now among the most recognizable corridors in the United States, was not yet defined by grandeur. It was wind and open space, the long breath of Lake Michigan pressing against a city that had only recently rebuilt itself after the Great Chicago Fire reduced much of it to ash. That fire did not humble Chicago. It clarified it. If anything, it hardened the city's sense of purpose. What had been lost would not simply be replaced. It would be exceeded. Steel would rise where wood had failed. Height would become a language of confidence. And along the lakefront, where the city met something vast and uncontrollable, there would be statements made in stone. The Congress Plaza Hotel began as one of those statements. Its origins are tied to a moment of extraordinary optimism, the approach of the world's Columbian Exposition. The fair was not merely an event. It was a declaration. Chicago intended to present itself to the world not as a recovering city, but as a finished one, cultured, powerful, and fully arrived. But a declaration requires infrastructure. Visitors would come by the millions. Industrialists, diplomats, artists, politicians, each expecting a city capable of hosting them not just efficiently, but impressively. Temporary pavilions could showcase innovation, but permanence had to be built elsewhere. Hotels would carry that burden. They would be the places where the image of Chicago was lived, not just observed. And so, along Michigan Avenue, plans began to take shape. The original structure, then known as the Auditorium Annex, was conceived as an extension of the nearby auditorium building, itself a masterpiece of architecture and ambition. The intention was not modest. This was to be a companion piece, a continuation of a vision that merged performance, hospitality, and prestige into a single, unified experience. The men behind these projects were not merely builders. They were interpreters of a new kind of American identity. Take Ferdinand with Peck, one of the key figures associated with the auditorium complex. Peck was not an architect by training, but he understood something equally important: perception. He believed that culture, music, art, architecture, was not ornamental, but essential to how a city justified its power. Chicago did not want to be seen as crude. It wanted refinement, and refinement required spaces that could perform it convincingly. The architects, including the legendary partnership of Dankmar Adler and Louis Sullivan, approached the project with a philosophy that rejected imitation. European styles could inspire, but they would not dictate. The building would be American in its scale, its function, and its confidence. For it would follow purpose. And the purpose here was clear: to create a space that could absorb the energy of a rapidly expanding city and present it as something controlled, elegant, and intentional. Construction moved quickly, driven by the immovable deadline of the Exposition. There was no room for hesitation. Materials arrived in constant flow. Labor worked in shifts that blurred the line between day and night. The building rose not gradually, but insistently, floor by floor, window by window, until it began to impose itself on the landscape. From the lake, it appeared as a kind of threshold. From the city, it marked an edge. Inside, every detail was calculated. High ceilings to create a sense of openness. Long corridors to manage the movement of guests without friction. Ballrooms designed not just for gatherings, but for spectacle. Spaces where the act of being seen was as important as the event itself. But beneath this precision, there were tensions. Chicago in the 1890s was not a harmonious city. It was a place of extremes. Immense wealth existed alongside grinding poverty. Industrial expansion created opportunity, but also instability. Labor unrest simmered beneath the surface, occasionally breaking into open conflict, as it would during events like the Pullman strike. The same city that built grand hotels also produced crowded tenements. The same economy that funded architecture of beauty relied on systems that were far less elegant. These contradictions were not hidden. They were simply compartmentalized. The Congress Plaza Hotel, though not yet known by that name, was part of that compartmentalization. It offered a version of Chicago that was curated, controlled, a space where the city's rough edges were smoothed over, where the noise of industry was replaced by music, conversation, and the quiet choreography of service. For guests, this was not deception. It was expectation. They did not come to see the whole city. They came to experience the version of it that justified their presence. And the hotel delivered. When the doors opened in 1893, timed with the influx of visitors to the Columbian Exposition, the building did exactly what it had been designed to do. It absorbed the world and reflected back an image of Chicago that was confident, composed, and undeniably modern. A newspaper from that year described the annex as a necessary extension of the city's ambition, executed with precision and without apology. The phrasing is revealing. Necessary, as if the building were not a luxury, but an obligation, a requirement imposed by the city's own sense of itself. And in many ways it was. Because Chicago's rise was not guaranteed. It had to be argued for, demonstrated, reinforced. Every structure along Michigan Avenue was part of that argument, each one contributing to a narrative that the city was not temporary, not volatile, not defined by its disasters, but stable, enduring, and worthy of attention. The Congress Plaza Hotel began as one of the strongest pieces of evidence in that case. But evidence, like reputation, requires maintenance. It must be upheld, protected, and continuously reaffirmed. And that is where the story begins to shift. Because the forces that built the hotel, the urgency, the ambition, the desire to impress, were not permanent conditions. They were moments, responses to a specific historical pressure that would, inevitably, pass. What happens to a place built for a moment when that moment ends? What happens when the urgency fades? And what remains is the structure itself, expensive to maintain, tied to an identity that may no longer be useful. The men who built the Congress Plaza Hotel believe they were creating something lasting. Not just a building, but a symbol. But symbols are fragile. They depend on collective agreement. And when that agreement begins to erode, even the most solid architecture can start to feel uncertain. The lake remained. The city continued to grow. And the hotel, newly opened, stood at the edge of both, ready to receive a world that was already beginning to change. Not the quiet rhythm it carries now, but something orchestrated, deliberate, almost theatrical. Doors revolving without pause. Bellhops moving with rehearsed precision. The low hum of conversation layered over the distant clink of glassware and the steady pulse of an orchestra tuning itself for the evening. Inside, time felt curated. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with newspapers folded neatly outside guest rooms. Headlines carried the weight of a rapidly changing nation. Industry expanding, politics shifting, fortunes rising and collapsing in cycles that felt both inevitable and unpredictable. And within the walls of the Congress Plaza Hotel, those forces did not just pass through. They gathered. This was where Chicago presented itself to power. The lobby became a kind of informal parliament. Industrialists arrived with purpose. Their conversations carried in low tones that suggested both urgency and control. Politicians moved through the space differently, slower, more visible, aware that being seen was part of the transaction. Journalists lingered at the edges, listening carefully, waiting for something that could be shaped into narrative. And above it all, the architecture held steady. Marble columns, high ceilings, chandeliers casting light that softened every surface, turning even the most practical exchange into something that felt elevated, intentional. In 1902, the hotel expanded, formally adopting the name that would define it, the Congress Plaza Hotel. The change was not cosmetic. It marked a transition from extension to identity, from something attached to the auditorium complex to something that stood on its own, both physically and symbolically. And it stood at exactly the right time. Chicago was no longer proving itself. It was asserting itself. Railroads connected it to every major artery of the country. Stockyards processed unimaginable volumes. Banks moved capital with increasing confidence. And along Michigan Avenue, the architecture began to reflect a city that no longer needed to ask for attention. It commanded it. The Congress Plaza Hotel became one of its central stages. Presidents stayed here. Theodore Roosevelt walked its corridors with the unmistakable energy that defined him, his presence turning ordinary moments into something sharper, more immediate. William Howard Taft, heavier in both frame and demeanor, occupied the space differently. Less kinetic, but no less significant. Their visits were not rare occurrences. They were expected. Power recognized the hotel as a place where it could operate efficiently, discreetly, and with the appropriate level of spectacle. But it was not only politics. The Congress Plaza Hotel became a cultural instrument as well. Evenings transformed the building. The same lobby that hosted negotiations by day shifted into something more fluid at night. Music filled the ballrooms. Live orchestras, carefully arranged, their sound designed to carry without overwhelming conversation. Dresses moved across polished floors in patterns that felt almost mathematical. Light reflected off glass, off jewelry, off the surfaces of a space designed to amplify presence. It was not simply entertainment. It was performance. And everyone inside understood their role. A 1911 account from a visiting columnist described the ballroom as a place where the city seems to forget its labor and remember only its elegance. The line carries a kind of quiet honesty. Because the labor was never absent, it was just relocated. Behind every polished surface, there were workers maintaining the illusion. Kitchen staff moving in relentless coordination. Housekeepers resetting rooms with precision that allowed no trace of previous occupants to remain. Maintenance crews ensuring that nothing, no flickering light, no worn edge, disrupted the experience being constructed above them. The hotel did not erase the realities of the city. It absorbed them, converted them into something consumable. And for a time, that conversion felt seamless. Guests returned not just because of comfort, but because of consistency. The hotel offered something rare in a rapidly changing world: predictability. A sense that within its walls, certain standards would hold, regardless of what was happening outside. But even within that stability, there were moments that hinted at something more complex. In 1920, during the early days of Prohibition, the hotel adapted with quiet efficiency. Publicly, it complied with the law. Privately, it adjusted. Alcohol did not disappear. It changed form. Conversations became more guarded. Access became more selective. What had once been open became discreet. The building learned. It learned how to maintain its identity while shifting its practices, how to preserve an image of legitimacy while accommodating the realities of a city that was, once again, negotiating with its own contradictions. And those contradictions were becoming harder to ignore. Chicago in the 1920s was not just prosperous, it was volatile. Organized crime expanded into spaces left open by new restrictions. Violence, once peripheral, began to intersect with everyday life in ways that felt unpredictable. The same city that hosted elegant evenings within the Congress Plaza Hotel also produced headlines that spoke of something darker, less controlled. And yet, inside the hotel, the performance continued. Guests arrived, music played, deals were made. The building held its composure, because that was its function, not to reflect reality in full, but to filter it, to present a version of the city that was manageable, refined, and above all controlled. For many, this was not a deception. It was a necessity. The world outside was changing too quickly. The pace of industry, the shifts in politics, the undercurrents of social tension, all of it created a sense of instability that demanded counterbalance. The Congress Plaza Hotel provided that balance, or at least the appearance of it. But appearances require energy. They require attention. And as the decades progressed, maintaining that level of control would become increasingly difficult. Not because the building changed overnight, but because the world around it refused to remain still. The lake continued its endless motion, indifferent to the lives unfolding beside it. The skyline began to rise higher, steel and glass, introducing a new architectural language that made older structures feel heavier, more rooted in a past that was already beginning to feel distant. And within the hotel, the rhythm, once so precise, so assured, began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. Not enough to alarm, not enough to disrupt, but enough that, if you were paying close attention, you might have noticed a hesitation, a slight delay in the choreography, the first indication that something, somewhere, was no longer aligning as perfectly as it once had. For decades, the Congress Plaza Hotel had perfected the art of concealment, not in the sense of secrecy, nothing so dramatic, but in something quieter, more effective. It knew how to direct attention, how to illuminate certain spaces while leaving others in shadow, how to create an experience so complete that few ever thought to question what lay beyond it. Because beneath the chandeliers, beneath the orchestras and polished floors, there was always another structure, not architectural, but human, and did not operate by the same rules. The hotel's public face was elegance. Its private reality was labor, constant, disciplined, and largely invisible. Hundreds of workers moved through its corridors each day, sustaining the illusion of effortlessness. They were not guests. They were not participants in the spectacle. They were its foundation. A housekeeper in 1926, whose testimony survives in a labor report, described her shift with careful restraint. You learn to move quietly, not because you are told to, but because the space demands it. You are present, but you are not meant to be noticed. The sentence reveals more than it intends, because it was not just about silence. It was about hierarchy. The Congress Plaza Hotel, like many institutions of its time, was built on a strict division of visibility. Those who arrived through the front entrance experienced one version of the building, open, bright, meticulously arranged. Those who entered through service corridors encountered something else entirely. Narrower spaces, harsher lighting, a pace that allowed little room for error. The separation was not accidental. It was designed, and for years, it functioned without disruption. But the world outside was changing, and those changes had a way of finding their way inside, no matter how carefully the boundaries were maintained. By the 1930s, the economic collapse of the Great Depression had begun to strain every institution it touched. The Congress Plaza Hotel was no exception. Fewer guests arrived with the same certainty. Spending became cautious. Expectations shifted, and within the hotel, the pressure moved downward. Staff were asked to do more with less. Hours extended. Wages tightened. The balance that had once allowed the illusion to operate smoothly began to destabilize. Not visibly, not immediately, but in ways that accumulated. A maintenance worker, interviewed years later, recalled the shift with blunt clarity. Nothing broke all at once. It just stopped being fixed the way it used to be. That distinction between breaking and not being repaired would define much of what followed. Because decline, in places like this, rarely announces itself. It begins as adjustment, and then becomes policy. During the 1940s and into the post-war years, the hotel remained active, even prestigious in certain circles. But something had changed beneath the surface. The relationship between ownership and labor, once managed through a combination of structure and expectation, began to fracture more openly. Workers organized, demands were made, and for the first time, the invisible structure that supported the hotel's public image began to assert itself. This was not unique to the Congress Plaza Hotel. Across the United States, labor movements were gaining momentum, challenging long-standing assumptions about who held power within institutions. But within the walls of a place so dependent on controlled presentation, the tension carried a particular weight. Because conflict disrupts illusion, and the hotel depended on illusion. In 1946, a local newspaper noted a labor dispute at the hotel, describing picket lines forming just outside its entrance. Guests arriving for what they expected to be a seamless experience were met instead with signs, voices, and a visible reminder that the building did not exist outside of the social realities surrounding it. The report was brief, almost dismissive, but its presence was significant because it marked a moment when the boundary between the hotel's curated interior and the city's more complicated exterior had been breached. And once breached, it could not be fully restored. Inside, management worked to maintain continuity. Service continued. Events were held. The orchestration of daily life resumed as closely as possible to its previous form. But the knowledge remained that the system was not as stable as it appeared, that it required negotiation, and that negotiation was not always quiet. At the same time, the broader identity of Chicago was shifting. The post-war era brought new forms of development, new priorities, new ways of imagining urban space. Modernism began to replace older architectural philosophies. Efficiency took precedence over ornamentation. New hotels emerged, designed with different assumptions about what guests wanted and what cities should look like. The Congress Plaza Hotel, once a symbol of arrival, began to feel anchored, not obsolete, but no longer at the forefront. And that shift mattered, because buildings like this rely not just on function, but on relevance. They must align with the identity a city is trying to project. And when that identity changes, even the most carefully constructed spaces can find themselves slightly out of step. The hotel did not collapse under this pressure. It adapted. But adaptation, in this case, meant compromise. Certain areas were modernized, but not completely. Systems were updated, but often selectively. Investments were made, but with caution, balancing the cost of preservation against the uncertainty of return. The result was not immediate decline. It was unevenness. A ballroom that retained its grandeur, adjacent to corridors that felt less attended to. Rooms that reflected earlier standards, alongside spaces that hinted at newer, less cohesive interventions. The coherence that had once defined the building began to fragment. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. And within that fragmentation, something else began to emerge. Stories. Guests spoke of rooms that felt unsettled, of hallways that seemed too quiet, of an atmosphere that was difficult to describe but easy to notice. These accounts were not uniform, and they were not always taken seriously.
But they accumulated, forming a secondary identity for the hotel, one that existed alongside its historical reputation. It became known in certain circles, not just as a place of history, but as a place of unease. Whether these stories were rooted in fact or in perception is, in some ways, beside the point, because what they reflect is something real. A building that had once been defined by clarity, of purpose, of function, of identity, was now carrying multiple narratives at once. Some official, some unofficial, some carefully maintained, others beyond control. And that multiplicity is where the story deepens, because it forces a question that is less comfortable than nostalgia. What exactly was the hotel built to sustain? Was it ever truly about hospitality alone? Or was it about maintaining a particular version of reality? One that required certain people to remain unseen, certain tensions to remain unacknowledged, certain costs to be absorbed quietly? And if so, what happens when those elements begin to surface? Not all at once, but gradually, inevitably, until the building can no longer contain them in the way it once did. Outside, the lake continued its steady, indifferent motion. The skyline grew more modern, more reflective, less ornate. The city moved forward, as cities do, and the Congress Plaza Hotel remained where it had always been, but no longer entirely in the role it was built to play. The moment did not arrive with warning. No single headline declared it. No ceremony marked its beginning. There was no clear line between what the Congress Plaza Hotel had been and what it was about to become. Instead, it came as a series of decisions. Small at first, then irreversible. By the late 20th century, Chicago had entered a new phase of its identity. Glass towers redefined the skyline. Corporate consolidation reshaped the way cities functioned. Hospitality itself was no longer about permanence, but about efficiency, standardized experiences, predictable returns, and spaces designed to be replicated rather than remembered. The Congress Plaza Hotel did not fit easily into that model. It was too large, too specific, too tied to a version of luxury that required constant, expensive care. Its architecture, once an advantage, became a liability. Ornate details that needed maintenance, aging systems that resisted modernization, spaces that were difficult to reconfigure without losing their character. And character, increasingly, was not the priority. Profit was. Ownership changed hands, not always with clarity, not always with long-term intention. Each transition carried with it a new set of calculations. What to preserve, what to ignore, what could be deferred without immediate consequence. At first, the changes were subtle. Renovations were partial. Repairs were delayed. Entire sections of the building were closed, not permanently, but indefinitely, held in a kind of suspended state where reopening was always possible, but never imminent. A guest staying in the hotel in 1978 wrote in a letter later archived by a local historian, "It feels like parts of the building are waiting for something that isn't coming." The phrasing is almost accidental in its precision. Waiting, not abandoned, not destroyed, just paused. But buildings are not designed to wait. They are designed to function. And when function begins to fragment, the structure itself starts to lose coherence. Not physically at first, but conceptually. Rooms become isolated from one another. Services become inconsistent. The experience, once seamless, begins to break into pieces. Guests notice, then they stop returning. The shift accelerates. By the 1980s, competition had intensified. New hotels, equipped with modern infrastructure and backed by corporate investment, began to draw away the clientele that had once defined the Congress Plaza Hotel's identity. Business travelers chose convenience. Events moved to venues that could guarantee uniformity. The hotel, once a destination, became an option, and not always the preferred one. Inside, the response was not decisive. It was reactive. Rates were adjusted. Marketing shifted. Certain upgrades were attempted, but rarely completed in a way that restored the building's former cohesion. The approach was not transformation. It was survival. And survival, in this context, came at a cost. Because every compromise, every delayed repair, every closed wing, every decision to prioritize short-term viability over long-term integrity pushed the hotel further from what it had been built to be. There was no single moment when this became irreversible, but there was a threshold, and once crossed, it changed everything. In 2003, a labor dispute erupted that would become one of the longest-running hotel strikes in American history. Employees, many of whom had worked in the building for decades, walked out, citing wages, working conditions, and management practices that they argued had deteriorated beyond negotiation. The picket lines formed outside the entrance once again, but this time they did not dissolve quickly. They remained. Days turned into months, months into years. The Congress Plaza Hotel continued to operate, but not as it once had. Replacement workers were brought in. Services were adjusted. The building adapted in the only way it could, by continuing, even as the structure beneath that continuation became increasingly unstable. A union representative, speaking during the early years of the strike, described the situation with stark clarity. "This isn't just about pay. It's about what kind of place this is allowed to become." The statement cut through the complexity, because by this point, the question was no longer about decline in the abstract. It was about direction. What exactly was the Congress Plaza Hotel becoming? And who was deciding? Guests arriving during this period encountered a building that still carried its history, but no longer fully embodied it. The architecture remained. The location remained. But the experience was inconsistent, shifting from floor to floor, from room to room, from one moment to the next. Some described it as charming in its imperfection. Others saw something else, a structure caught between identities, unable to fully return to its past, but not yet committed to a new future. The strike itself became part of the hotel's story. Visible, persistent, impossible to ignore. Signs lined the sidewalks. Voices carried across Michigan Avenue. The boundary between the building and the city, once carefully managed, was now fully exposed. And with that exposure came a kind of clarity. Because the Congress Plaza Hotel was no longer just a place of history. It was a site of conflict, a space where questions about labor, ownership, value, and responsibility were not abstract, but immediate, played out in real time, in front of anyone who chose to look. This was the turning point. Not because the building closed. It didn't. Not because it was destroyed. It wasn't. But because the narrative that had sustained it for more than a century, the idea of the hotel as a controlled, cohesive expression of Chicago's ambition, could no longer be maintained. Too many fractures, too many competing realities, too many decisions that had accumulated without resolution. The hotel continued to stand, but it no longer stood for the same things. Outside, the lake remained unchanged, its surface moving with the same quiet persistence it always had. The skyline, now dominated by glass and steel, reflected a city that had embraced a different kind of ambition, one less concerned with permanence, more aligned with adaptability. In between them, the Congress Plaza Hotel held its position, not fallen, not restored, but altered in a way that could not be undone. Because the turning point in stories like this is not the moment something ends. It is the moment when continuation itself begins to feel like a kind of loss. Decline does not announce itself with silence. It arrives with noise, misaligned, uneven, difficult to ignore once you know what to listen for. In the Congress Plaza Hotel, that noise was not the collapse of walls or the failure of structure. It was something subtler. The hum of systems no longer synchronized. The echo of footsteps in corridors that should have been full. The faint, persistent sense that the building was operating, but not entirely functioning. By the early 2000s, the hotel had entered a state that is harder to describe than ruin. Because ruin suggests finality. This was something else. Continuation without cohesion. Guests still checked in. Rooms were still occupied. Lights still turned on each evening, casting the same warm glow across surfaces that had witnessed more than a century of movement. From the outside, the building remained intact, its facade steady against the shifting skyline, its presence unchanged along Michigan Avenue. But inside, the experience had fractured. Entire floors existed in partial use. Some rooms maintained, others left in a condition that suggested interruption rather than closure. Carpets bore the imprint of years without replacement. Fixtures functioned, but not always reliably. Elevators moved, but with a hesitation that felt less mechanical than symbolic. A guest review from 2006 described the sensation with careful ambiguity. It feels like staying in two different hotels at once. One preserved, one forgot. That duality became the defining characteristic of the Congress Plaza Hotel in its later years. Not abandonment, not preservation, but coexistence between what had been maintained and what had been allowed to fade. The ongoing labor strike, stretching year after year, continued to shape the building's internal reality. Staff turnover increased. Institutional knowledge, once passed quietly from one generation of workers to the next, began to dissipate. The choreography that had once defined service, the invisible precision that made everything appear effortless, was no longer consistent. And inconsistency, in a place built on control, is impossible to conceal. A former concierge, speaking in an oral history recorded in 2012, recalled the change with a kind of restrained grief. It wasn't that people stopped trying. It was that the system they were trying to maintain no longer existed in the same way. The sentence lingers, because it shifts the focus. This was not simply a story of neglect. It was a story of structure, of how systems, once disrupted, are not easily restored. The Congress Plaza Hotel had been designed for a specific kind of operation, a hierarchy of roles, a continuity of care, a shared understanding of what the building was meant to represent. When those elements began to erode, the building did not collapse. It adapted, but adaptation, in this case, meant fragmentation. Events still took place, but less frequently. Certain ballrooms remained in use, their grandeur intact under controlled conditions, while adjacent spaces sat unused, dim, quiet, carrying a different atmosphere entirely. Guests moved through these transitions without warning. A corridor might shift from well-lit to shadowed within a few steps. A door might open onto a space that felt suspended in time. Furniture arranged, but untouched. Air still, as if waiting for something that had already passed. These were not deliberate design choices. They were the result of accumulation. Years of decisions layered upon one another, each individually manageable, collectively transformative. Outside, the city continued to accelerate. Chicago in the early 21st century was a place of reinvention. Old industrial zones gave way to residential developments. Technology firms moved into spaces once occupied by manufacturing. The language of the city shifted toward efficiency, toward innovation, toward a future that prioritized flexibility over permanence. And in that context, the Congress Plaza Hotel became increasingly difficult to categorize. It was not obsolete, but was no longer aligned. Its scale, once an asset, became a challenge. Its history, once a foundation, became a complication. To restore it fully would require an investment that few were willing to make. To replace it would mean erasing something that still held cultural weight. So it remained, in between, a building functioning within a system that had moved beyond the conditions it was designed for. There were moments, brief, controlled, when the old identity resurfaced. A well-executed event, a carefully maintained suite, a glimpse of what the hotel had once been capable of sustaining consistently. But these moments were isolated. They did not define the whole. And over time, the gap between those moments and the broader experience became more pronounced. Visitors began to describe the hotel not just in terms of its history, but in terms of its atmosphere. Words like uneven, unsettling, strange. Not accusations, not condemnations, but observations. Attempts to articulate a feeling that did not fit neatly into categories of good or bad. Because the Congress Plaza Hotel, in its decline, had not become a failure.
It had become something more ambiguous. A place where multiple timelines seemed to exist at once. Where the past was not gone, but not fully present either. Where the intention of the building, its original purpose, could still be sensed, but no longer consistently experienced. And that ambiguity carried a cost, not just in revenue, but in meaning. Because buildings derive their significance not only from what they are, but from how clearly they express it. And here, clarity had been replaced by contradiction. The lake outside remained constant, its surface shifting with a rhythm that had no concern for human structures. The skyline continued to evolve, each new tower reinforcing a narrative of progress that moved forward without hesitation. And the Congress Plaza Hotel stood between them, still open, still occupied, but no longer whole. The final moments of decline are rarely marked by closure. More often, they're defined by endurance, a continued existence that no longer aligns with its original purpose, sustained not by vision, but by inertia. The Congress Plaza Hotel did not fall. It persisted, and in that persistence, it revealed something difficult to accept, that a place can remain standing long after the idea that built it has quietly disappeared. The building is still there. On certain mornings, when the light comes in low from Lake Michigan and the traffic along Michigan Avenue has not yet reached its full volume, the Congress Plaza Hotel appears almost unchanged. The facade holds its lines. The windows catch the same pale reflection of water and sky. For a moment, brief, fragile, it is possible to imagine that nothing has shifted, that the decades between then and now have simply folded in on themselves. But that illusion does not hold. Step closer, and the layers begin to separate. The entrance still opens as it always has, but what waits inside is not a single story. It is many existing at once. The polished surfaces remain, but they no longer define the space. They coexist with signs of interruption, subtle, persistent, impossible to ignore once noticed. This is not a ruin. It is something more complex, a place that survived its own purpose. Because the Congress Plaza Hotel was never just a building. It was an agreement, a shared understanding between a city and itself about what it wanted to be seen as. At its height, that agreement was clear. The hotel stood as proof that Chicago had arrived, that it could offer not just industry, but refinement. Not just expansion, but control. And for a time, That proof was accepted. But agreements change. Sometimes gradually, sometimes without acknowledgement, and sometimes in ways that are only visible long after the fact, when the structures built to support them no longer quite fit. The Congress Plaza Hotel did not fail in the way people expect. It was not destroyed by disaster. It was not abandoned overnight. It was not replaced by something more efficient or more modern. Instead, it remained, while everything around it adjusted. And in that adjustment, its meaning shifted. A building designed to represent permanence became an example of something else entirely. Endurance without clarity. Presence without alignment. That transformation is not unique. Cities are filled with places like this. Structures that once carried a precise identity, now operating in a space where that identity has blurred. But few make the shift as visibly or as quietly as this one. Because here, the evidence is still accessible, in the scale of the rooms, in the proportions of the corridors, in the way certain spaces still seem prepared for a level of attention they no longer consistently receive. These are not just architectural details. They are remnants of intention. And intention, once embedded, does not disappear easily. It lingers, even when it is no longer supported. A historian writing in the early 2010s described the hotel as a place caught between preservation and neglect, where the past is neither restored nor erased, only carried forward in fragments. The phrasing avoids sentiment. It does not mourn. It observes. And in that observation, it captures something essential, not just about the Congress Plaza Hotel, but about the way societies interact with their own creations. Because this story is not only about a building, it is about decision-making, about what is maintained and what is deferred, about which histories are preserved actively, and which are allowed to persist passively, without investment, without clear intention, sustained only by the fact that removing them would require more effort than leaving them in place. That kind of preservation is not neutral. It carries consequences. The Congress Plaza Hotel continues to operate. Guests still arrive. Rooms are still occupied. From a distance, it remains part of the city's active landscape, a functioning entity within a functioning system. But function is not the same as meaning, and meaning is what has shifted most profoundly. There was a time when entering this building meant stepping into a carefully constructed narrative, one that aligned with the city's ambitions, its self-image, its understanding of progress. Today, entering the same space presents something less resolved, a question rather than an answer. What does it mean to keep something alive without fully committing to it? What does it say about a city or a society that allows its symbols to persist in altered forms, not because they are actively valued, but because they have not yet been deemed inconvenient enough to remove? The lake outside does not respond to these questions. It continues its steady motion, the same rhythm that has outlasted every phase of the city's development. The skyline, sharper now, more reflective, carries forward a different kind of confidence, one less tied to permanence, more aligned with adaptability. And between them, the Congress Plaza Hotel remains, not as it was, not entirely as it is, but as something unresolved, a structure that reveals, in its continued existence, the quiet complexity of change, not the dramatic kind that announces itself with collapse, but the gradual kind that reshapes meaning while leaving the surface intact. It is easy to look at places like this and feel a sense of loss, to imagine what has faded, to measure what is no longer present. But that perspective, while understandable, is incomplete, because it focuses on the building and not on the choices. The Congress Plaza Hotel did not become what it is by accident. It was shaped over decades by decisions made in offices, in meetings, in moments that felt practical at the time, each one small enough to justify, each one contributing to an outcome that no single person fully intended. That is the unsettling part, not that something grand diminished, but that it did so through processes that felt ordinary, reasonable, even necessary, which brings us back to the present, to the building as it stands now, still open, still visible, still part of the city's daily life, a place that can be entered, experienced, and left without fully understanding what it represents. Unless you choose to look closer, unless you ask the question that lingers beneath everything else, not just what happened here, but what it reveals about us, about how we define value, about how we treat the things we once believed were worth building carefully, maintaining consistently, and preserving with intention. And whether, when those beliefs shift, we recognize the cost of letting them go, or simply continue forward, allowing the structures that carried them to remain, unchanged on the surface, altered in every other way. Standing there, at the edge of the lake, with the city rising behind it, and the past still embedded in its walls, the Congress Plaza Hotel offers no clear conclusion. Only a quiet, persistent question. When we allow something to endure without truly caring for it, are we preserving history or slowly erasing it?